Look at the events you've written down. Is it real to you that the conclusion you reached, I'm not worthy, is a valid interpretation of those events? Can you agree that virtually any child at that age and in those situations would have reached a similar conclusion? Now we're going to play the possibilities game. We'll imagine that 4 friends of yours are visiting you and looking at a videotape of the events you just wrote down. Your interpretation of those events when you were a child was, I'm not worthy. That is one valid interpretation of Mom and Dad's behavior. But there are other reasonable interpretations of the same childhood events that you didn't think of as a child. So, let's ask each of your friends for another alternative interpretation. Can you see that one friend might well say, your parents may actually have preferred one of your siblings to you. That doesn't mean you aren't worthy. Couldn't that explain the events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation that I'm not worthy? Here's what your second friend says. Your parents' comments were due to their poor parenting skills. How they treated you had nothing to do with your worth. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation that I'm not worthy? Here's a third possible interpretation of your childhood events that one of your friends suggests. Maybe you weren't worthy as a kid. That doesn't mean you never will be. Doesn't this interpretation also explain those events in your childhood just as well as your interpretation that I'm not worthy? Here's another one. Maybe your parents thought you weren't worthy. That doesn't mean they were right. Or if it was church, maybe your church believed that people weren't worthy. But that doesn't mean every church believes that. Couldn't any one of these interpretations explain your childhood interactions with your parents just as well as your interpretation, I'm not worthy? Of course they can. So is it real to you that a belief you've lived with almost your entire life, something you thought was a fact, is not a fact? It isn't the truth at all. It's only a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier events. Right? Please continue to interact totally with this program in order for it to work. And that includes answering my questions out loud, even if your answer is only yes or no. So let me repeat the question. Is it real that I'm not worthy is not a fact? It's not the truth, but just a truth, merely one interpretation of many possible interpretations of earlier childhood events. I bet you do now. With a little help from me and your friends, you could see that your parents' comments about you not deserving things could have at least 4 different meanings. Do you remember what you wrote down a few minutes ago as the source of your belief, I'm not worthy? Look at that text below on your screen. Right now, imagine seeing what you saw then and hearing what you heard then. Now take a moment and really imagine the events of your childhood that led you to form the belief, I'm not worthy. Didn't it seem when you were a child as if you could actually see, I'm not worthy, in those earlier events with your parents or in church? It did, didn't it? You may have the sense that you didn't see the belief. You felt it. Once you formed the belief, I'm not worthy, you probably did feel it. I'll get back to that feeling in a minute, but what I'd like you to focus on now is not the feeling, but on my question. Didn't it seem as if you saw, I'm not worthy? As if you could point to it? As if you could have said to me, Look, Aunt Shelley, can't you see I'm not worthy? I didn't hear you. Did you say yes? Now that you think you saw I'm not worthy as a child, I'd like you to look again. Did you really see I'm not worthy? If you did, what does I'm not worthy look like? Could you really point to it? Does I'm not worthy have a color, a shape, a location? Is it real to you now that you saw events, but you never really did see I'm not worthy? If anything you could really see can be described, and if you can't describe what I'm not worthy looks like, is it real now that you never really saw it? Since you never really saw I'm not worthy, what did you actually see? Is it clear now all you really saw was your parents telling you you weren't deserving? In other words, all you saw was a series of events. Or if your belief came from what you heard in church, all you heard is what one person or organization said. Did you ever see that it was true? Or did you just see someone say something? You see, what happened was that you looked at a series of events that can be interpreted in many different ways. You gave the events one meaning, which was, I'm not worthy. By attributing that specific meaning to the events, each time you saw Mom and Dad or anyone else saying you weren't deserving or you weren't worthy, it was as if you could see that meaning in their comments and behavior. But you didn't discover the meaning in the events. You gave the meaning to the events. They had no meaning before you created one. I don't mean that how your parents treated you didn't matter. It clearly did. You didn't like not getting things you wanted or being told some of the things your parents said to you. But there is a difference between something mattering and it having any inherent meaning. Is it real now that the events had no meaning until you gave them one? Here's another way to understand that events have no inherent meaning. When I say that, I am saying you don't know anything for sure about you, about other people, about life as a result of these experiences. What do I know for sure about you from knowing what your parents or others said or did when you were a child? Is it clear that I wouldn't know anything? And if I don't know anything, you don't either. All you know for sure is what actually happened. Your mom and dad said things like, you don't deserve to have it. And finally, if you never saw I'm not worthy out there in the world, where's it been all these years? Did I hear you say that I'm not worthy has only ever existed in your mind? That you never did see it out there in the world? That's right. If the belief is more real to you as a feeling than as a concept, here's another way to look at it. Didn't it seem as if the behavior and comments from your parents and others when you were a child made you feel, I'm not worthy? It did, didn't it? But you just agreed that the events have no meaning. Is it possible for events that have no meaning to make you feel, I'm not worthy, or anything else for that matter? Of course not. So, if people's comments couldn't have made you feel, I'm not worthy, what did make you feel that? Yup. By now I think you know the answer to that question. Please answer out loud. That's right. You felt that only because that's the meaning you had already given those comments. Let me help you make this real. Imagine that Auntie Shelley had been there when you were a little child and had shown you the alternative interpretations for those two situations. And after that conversation with me, you concluded, other people's comments had nothing to do with my worth. Just because they thought I wasn't worthy doesn't mean it was true. Here's what I'd like you to do now. Take a moment and really imagine being a child and hearing from your parents or at church that you aren't worthy. As you imagine the events, apply this different interpretation to their behavior. Notice how it feels to be a child who's thinking, other people's comments had nothing to do with my worth. Just because they thought I wasn't worthy doesn't mean it's true. You can use the pause button below to pause the video while you make these childhood scenarios more real for yourself. When you're done imagining, press the play button. As you imagine this scene, does it still feel like your parents' words and actions are making you feel, I'm not worthy? Probably not. And if you didn't feel I'm not worthy then, would you feel it now? Again, the answer is no. So people's comments never caused you to feel I'm not worthy. That feeling came from your interpretation of their behavior. And since your feelings were not caused by events in reality, they were only the result of a meaning you made up to explain the events. Is it real that the feelings you had when your parents or others told you you didn't deserve to have things you wanted, didn't tell you anything at all about you or how worthy you were as a human being? They didn't, did they? Okay, now let's take a deep breath. Let it out slowly, and then say out loud, I'm not worthy. Is that the truth? Does it still feel like the truth? Your answer is very important here. Okay, take another deep breath and say, I'm not worthy, out loud. I'll bet it feels very different when you say these words now than when you said them at the beginning of this exercise. Do these words still feel true? Even a little bit? Unless the belief is 100% gone and the words don't feel true at all, you probably still have the belief. Remember, holding a belief is like being pregnant. You either is or you ain't. There's no sort of. If the belief is still there, it probably still seems like you saw it. Once it no longer seems as if you saw, I'm not worthy, in those early events, the belief will be gone. So please click the repeat button to repeat that step of the process. If the belief is gone, please click continue.